It seems clear at any rate that the early superiority of Chinese science and technology through long centuries must be placed in relation to the elaborate, rationalized and conscious mechanisms of a society having the character of Asiatic bureaucracy. It was a society which functioned fundamentally in a learned way, the seats of power being filled by scholars, not military commanders. Central authority relied a great deal upon the automatic functioning of the village communities, and in general tended to reduce to the minimum its intervention in their life. I have already written above of the fundamental difference between peasant farmers on the one hand and shepherds or seamen on the other. This difference is expressed epigrammatically in the Chinese terms hui and wu wei. Wei meant application of the force of willpower, the determination that things, animals, or even other men should do what they were ordered to do, but wu wei was the opposite of this, leaving things alone, letting nature take her course, profiting by going with the grain of things instead of going against it, and knowing how not to interfere. Note: I remember that during the war I had a friend in the Foreign Office in London who had a huge Chinese scroll beside his desk, with these two characters alone on it, and when later on I became master of Guise, I found that it was essentially a practical dictum. Things worked better if you left the college lecturers, the dean and chaplain, and the kitchen office to get on with it without any interference from above. End of note. Wu Wei was the great Taoist watchword throughout the ages, the untaught doctrine, the wordless edict. Note: see Science and Civilization in China, Volume 2, page 564. End of note. It was summarized in that numinous group of phrases which Bertrand Russell collected from his time in China: production without possession, action without self-assertion, development without domination. Note: Science and Civilization in China, Volume 2, page 164, from Bertrand Russell, The Problem of China, 1922, page 194. Now, Wu Wei, the lack of interference, might very well be applied to a respect for the automotive capacity of the individual farmers and their peasant communities. Even when the old Asiatic society had given place to bureaucratic feudalism, such conceptions remained very much alive in Chinese political practice and government administration that had been inherited from ancient Asian society and from the single pair of opposites, villages-prince. Thus, all through Chinese history, the best magistrate was he who intervened least in society's affairs, and all through history, too, the chief aim of clans and families was to settle their affairs internally, without having recourse to the courts. Note: an aspect of the darker side of this is given in the partly autobiographical account of my old friend Kok Yu Shou, 1963. End of note. It seems probable that a society like this would be favourable to reflection upon the world of nature. Man should try to penetrate as far as possible into the mechanisms of the natural world and to utilize these sources of power which it contained, while intervening directly as little as possible, and utilizing action at a distance. Conceptions of this kind, highly intelligent, sought always to achieve effects with the economy of means, and naturally encouraged the investigation of nature for essentially Baconian reasons. Note: one can see what this implies by imagining a city on the side of a hill above a river, where water was needed for the upper streets. The Confucians would have had squads of men peddling square pallet chain pumps to send up the water from the river, but the Taoist way would have been quite different. They would have taken off a derivate canal from the river at a higher level, and by guiding it along the contours, they would have reached the upper streets of the city on a Wu Wei principle. End of note. Hence such early triumphs as those of the seismograph, the casting of iron, and water power. Note: one might add the magnetic compass, deep borehole drilling, and the escapement of clockwork, and many other inventions listed below. End of note. It might thus be said that this non-interventionist conception of human activity was, to begin with, propitious for the development of the natural sciences. For example, the predilection for action at a distance had great effects in early wave theory, the discovery of the nature of the tides, the knowledge of relations between mineral bodies and plants, as in geobotanical prospecting, or again in the science of magnetism. It is often forgotten that one of the fundamental features of the great breakthrough of modern science in the time of Galileo was the knowledge of magnetic polarity, declination, etc. And unlike Euclidean geometry and Ptolemaic astronomy, magnetical science was a totally non-European contribution. Note: see Needham, 1960, A. Nothing had been known of it to speak of in Europe before the end of the 12th century, and its transmission from the earlier work of the Chinese is not in doubt. If the Chinese were, apart from the Babylonians, the greatest observers among all ancient peoples, was it not perhaps precisely because of the encouragement of non-interventionist principles enshrined in the numinous poetry of the Taoists on the water symbol and the eternal feminine? Note: compare Science and Civilization in China, Volume 2, page 57. End of note. However, if the non-interventionist character of the villages-prince relationship engendered a certain conception of the world which was propitious to the progress of science, it had certain natural limitations. It was not congruent with characteristically Occidental interventionism, so natural to a people of shepherds and seafarers. Since it was not capable of allowing the mercantile mentality a leading place in their civilization, it was not capable of fusing together the techniques of the higher artisanate with the methods of mathematical and logical reasoning which the scholars had worked out, so that the passage from the Vintian to the Galilean stage in the development of modern natural science was not achieved, perhaps not possible. In medieval China, there had been more systematic experimentation than the Greeks had ever attempted, or medieval Europe either. Note: Nathan Rosenberg has suggested to us that a new attitude almost of deference to experimental results arose in Europe from the 16th century onwards, with the dominance of the bourgeoisie, which was not paralleled elsewhere. This attitude is very similar to that of merchants interested in quantitative accounting. See Rosenberg and Burzel, 1986. End of note. But so long as bureaucratic feudalism remained unchanged, mathematics could not come together with empirical nature observation and experiment to produce something fundamentally new. The suggestion is that experiment demanded too much active intervention, and while this had always been accepted in the arts and trades, indeed more so than in Europe, it was perhaps more difficult in China to make it philosophically respectable. There was another way also in which medieval Chinese society had been highly favourable to the growth of the natural sciences at the pre-Renaissance level. Traditional Chinese society was highly organic, highly cohesive. The state was responsible for the good functioning of the entire society, even if this responsibility was carried out with the minimum intervention. One remembers that the ancient definition of the ideal ruler was that he should sit simply facing the south and exert his virtue in all directions, so that the 10,000 things would automatically be well governed. As we have been able to show over and over again, the state brought powerful aid to scientific research. Note: Science and Civilization in China, Volumes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. End of note. Astronomical observatories, for example, keeping millennial records, were part of the civil service. Vast encyclopedias, not only literary but also medical and agricultural, were published at the expense of the state, and scientific expeditions, altogether remarkable for their time, were successfully accomplished. One thinks of the early 8th century geodetic survey of a meridian arc stretching from Indochina to Mongolia, and the expedition to chart the constellations of the southern hemisphere to within 20 degrees of the south celestial pole. Note: see Beer, Ho-Ping Yu, Lu Guizhen, Needham, Pulley-Blank and Thompson, an 8th century meridian line, Yi Xing's chain of gnomons, and the prehistory of the metric system. 1964. By contrast, science in Europe was generally a private enterprise. Therefore, it hung back for many centuries. Yet state science and medicine in China were not capable of making, when the time came, that qualitative leap which happened in Occidental science and medicine in the 16th and early 17th century. Intimately associated with this qualitative leap is the idea of scientific progress. Let us now follow the conception of a progressive development of knowledge further, far beyond the level of ancient techniques. It would be quite a mistake to imagine that Chinese culture never generated this conception, for one can find textual evidence in every period showing that in spite of their veneration for the sages, Chinese scholars and scientists believed that there had been progress beyond the knowledge of their distant ancestors. Indeed, the whole series of some 100 astronomical calendars between 370 BC and 1742 BC illustrates the point. For many new emperors wanted one which would necessarily be better and more accurate than any of those that had gone before. No mathematician or astronomer in any Chinese century would have dreamed of astronomical constants. The same also may be said to be true of the pharmaceutical naturalists, whose descriptions of the kingdoms of nature grew and grew. The number of main entries in the major pharmaceutical natural histories between 200 AD and 1600 AD show the growth of knowledge through the centuries. An unduly sharp rise just after 1100 AD is probably referable to increasing acquaintance with foreign, especially Arabic and Persian, minerals, plants and animals, with a synonymic multiplication which subsequently righted itself, on which see Volume 6, Part 1. The position in China could be well worth contrasting in detail with that in Europe. In his great work, Berry, 1924, showed long ago that before the time of Francis Bacon, only very scanty rudiments of the conception of progress are to be found in Western scholarly literature. The birth of this conception was involved in the famous 16th and 17th century controversy between the supporters of the ancients and those of the moderns, for the studies of the humanists had made it clear that there were new things, such as gunpowder, printing, and the magnetic compass, which the ancient Western world had not possessed. The fact that these and many other innovations had come from China or other parts of Asia was long overlooked. But the history of science and technology as we know it was born at the same time out of the perplexity which this discovery had generated. Berry had dealt with progress in relation to the history of culture in general. Zilsel enlarged his method to deal with progress in relation to the ideal of science. See Zilsel's writings between 1940 and 1945. End of note. The ideal of scientific progress included, he thought, the following ideas. A. That scientific knowledge is built up brick by brick through the contributions of generations of workers. B. That the building is never completed. And C. That the scientist's aim is a disinterested contribution to this building, either for its own sake or for the public benefit, not for fame or private personal advantage. Zilsel was able to show very clearly that expressions of these beliefs, whether in word or deed, were extremely unusual before the Renaissance, and even then they developed not among the scholars, who still sought individualistic personal glory, but among the higher artisanate, where cooperation sprang quite naturally from working conditions. Since the social situation in the era of the rise of capitalism favoured the activities of these men, their ideal was able to make headway in the world. Zilsel traces the first appearance of the idea of the continuous advancement of craftsmanship and science to Matthias Rorixe, whose book on cathedral architecture appeared in 1486. Note, this work is entitled Das Buchlein von der Verlen Gerechtigkeit. There is a facsimile reproduction published by Geldner, 1965. End of note. Thus, science, said Zilsel, both in its theoretical and utilitarian interpretations, came to be regarded as the product of a cooperation for non-personal ends, a cooperation in which all scientists of the past, the present, and the future have a part. Today, he went on, this idea or ideal seems almost self-evident, yet no Brahmanic Buddhist, Muslim, or Latin scholastic, no Confucian scholar or Renaissance humanist, no philosopher or rhetor of classical antiquity ever achieved it. He would have done better to leave out the reference to the Confucian scholars until Europe knew a little more about them, for in fact it would seem that the idea of cumulative, disinterested, cooperative enterprise in amassing scientific information was much more customary in medieval China than anywhere in the pre-Renaissance West. Some Asian scholars have been suspicious of the idea of the Asian mode of production or bureaucratic feudalism because they have identified it with an unassumed stagnation, which they thought they saw in the history of their own societies. Note, an example of belief in Chinese stagnation is to be found in the small book of Qianwen Yuan, 1985, The Great Inertia, Scientific Stagnation in Traditional China. End of note. In the name of the right of the Asian and African people to progress, they have projected this feeling into the past, and have wished to claim for their ancestors exactly the same stages as those which the West had itself gone through, that Western world which had for a time dominated so hatefully over them. It is, I think, very important to clear up this misunderstanding, for there seems no reason at all why we should assume a priori that China and other ancient civilizations passed through exactly the same social stages as the European West. In fact, the word stagnation was never applicable to China at all. It was purely a Western misconception. A continuing general and scientific progress manifested itself in traditional Chinese society, but this was violently overtaken by the exponential growth of modern science after the Renaissance in Europe. China was homeostatic, cybernetic if you like, but never stagnant. In case after case it can be shown with overwhelming probability the fundamental discoveries and inventions made in China were transmitted to Europe. For example, magnetic science, equatorial celestial coordinates, and the equatorial mounting of observational astronomical instruments. Note, Needham, 1955. Quantitative cartography, the technology of cast iron. Compare Needham, the development of iron and steel technology in China, 1958. This was written with the collaboration of Wang Ling, but our volume of ferrous metallurgy is now in the hands of Donald Wagner of Copenhagen, whose study of the subject will be, we hope, the last word on it for many years. End of note. Essential components of the reciprocating steam engine, such as the double-acting principle and the standard interconversion of rotary and longitudinal motion. Note, see Needham 1961 and 1963. End of note. The mechanical clock. Note, compare Needham, Wang Ling and S. Price, Heavenly Clockwork, 1960. We still think that the idea of the escapement came over to Europe at the end of the 13th century as a kind of stimulus diffusion from China. The water wheel linkwork escapement had originated in China, at least from the beginning of the 8th century onwards, and it still seems to us quite likely that somebody said in Europe at the end of the 13th century, "In the East, men have found a way of slowing down the revolution of a wheel until it keeps pace with the diurnal revolution of the stars, mankind's primary clock." Whereupon the Europeans set to and developed their own escapement, which was quite a different one, namely the verge and folio. End of note. The boot stirrup and the efficient equine harnesses. Note, the latter has already been described in Science and Civilization in China, Volume 4, Part 2, pages 304 and following, but the former will be described in Volume 5, Part 8, as part of the cavalry material. End of note. To say nothing of gunpowder and all that followed therefrom. Note, see Science and Civilization in China, Volume 5, Part 7. Some of the multifarious influences of Chinese inventions and discoveries of the pre-Renaissance world have been emphasized by Lin White in Medieval Technology and Social Change, 1962. The book of Gimple, The Medieval Machine, 1976, is much less sensitive to them. End of note. These many diverse discoveries and inventions had earth-shaking effects in Europe, but in China the social order of bureaucratic feudalism was very little disturbed by them. The built-in instability of European society must therefore be contrasted with a homeostatic equilibrium in China, the product, I believe, of a society fundamentally more rational. What remains is an analysis of the relationships of social classes in China. The clashes between them in the West have been charted well enough, but in China the problem is much more difficult because of the non-hereditary nature of the bureaucracy. It may well be that bureaucratic feudalism lasted so long because of the characteristic methods of wet rice cultivation. Everyone pondering it has come away with the feeling that is predominantly Gartenbau situation, to use the German term, rather like the art of gardening itself. Francesca Bray, in her volume on the history of agriculture in China, adumbrated this very clearly. She wrote, "From the very outset, we believe the fundamental constraints, both technical and social, of wet rice cultivation significantly influenced China's peculiar path of development." Note: Science and Civilization in China, Volume 6, Part 2, page 613. End of note. And again, unlike dryland agriculture, in wet rice areas, successful farming depends less on equipment than skill, less on capital investment and economies of skill than on labour shrewdly applied. Note: I bid, page 611. She went on to write, "It is clear that the small size of units of production and of individual fields suited to efficient wet rice production is a barrier to economies of scale, and thus to technical inventiveness of the type which we owe to the European agricultural and industrial revolution, that is, a tendency towards mechanization and improved returns to labour." Note: I bid, page 613. End of note. She concluded, "In wet rice societies, the natural course of development appears to be not towards capitalism, but towards a social formation that may conveniently be called a petty commodity mode of production. Once this stage is reached, the relations of production in wet rice cultivation have an internal dynamism that enables them to sustain not only significant increases in agricultural productivity, but also rapid economic diversification, without undergoing historical change." Note: I bid, page 616. End of note. In her separate book on the rice economies, Francesca Bray, 1986, returns to this theme. "European historical methodology," she writes, page 1, "has understandably been profoundly marked by the growth of capitalism. But it is doubtful to what extent models derived from Europe's highly specific experience are applicable to other parts of the world." She makes a distinction, page 7, between mechanical technologies, like that of European agriculture, and skill-oriented technologies, such as rice cultivation, and she concludes, page 207, that the transition to capitalist relations of production, whereby landowners evicting their tenants in order to run large consolidated farms using cheap wage labour, did not occur in China. On the last page of her volume in Science and Civilization in China, she concluded, "It seems then that while wet rice cultural systems can produce rapid, sustained technical and economic development, it is to the harder dry land systems that we must look for real social transformation and historical change." In recent decades, much interest has been aroused in the history of science and technology in the great non-European civilizations, especially China and India. Interest, that is, on the part of scientists, engineers, philosophers, and Orientalists, but little, on the whole, among historians. Why, one may ask, has the history of Chinese and Indian science been unpopular among them? Lack of the necessary linguistic and cultural tools for approaching the original sources has naturally been an inhibition. And of course, if one is primarily attracted to 18th and 19th century science, European developments will monopolize one's interest. But I believe there is a deeper reason. The study of great civilizations in which modern science and technology did not spontaneously develop obviously tends to raise the causal problem of how modern science did come into being at the European end of the Old World, and it does so in acute form. Indeed, the more brilliant the achievements of the ancient and medieval Asian civilizations turn out to have been, the more discomforting the problem becomes. During the past 50 years, historians of science in Western countries have tended to reject the sociological theories of the origin of modern science, which had a considerable innings earlier in the century. The forms in which such hypotheses had then been presented were doubtless relatively crude, but that was surely no reason why they should not have been refined. Note: such is the adjective generally applied to B. Hesson's famous paper on the social and economic roots of Newton's Principia, delivered at the International Congress of the History of Science at London in 1932. It was certainly in plain, blunt, Cromwellian style, but already half a dozen years later, R.K. Merton's remarkable monograph, Science, Technology and Society in 17th Century England, 1938, had achieved a considerably more refined and sophisticated presentation. Much is owing also to the works of Zilsel, 1941-5. End of note. Perhaps also the hypotheses themselves were felt to be too unsettling for a period during which the history of science was establishing itself as a factual academic discipline. Many historians were prepared to see science having an influence on society, but not to admit that society influenced science, and they liked to think of the progress of science solely in terms of the internal or autonomous filiation of ideas, theories, mental or mathematical techniques handed on like torches from one great man to another. They have been essentially internalists or autonomists. In other words, there was a man sent from God whose name was Kepler. Note: though off the rails at various points, J. Agassi is entertaining on this topic in his monograph Towards an Historiography of Science, 1963. The inductive historians of science, he says, are chiefly concerned with questions of whom to worship and for what reasons, but he does not like the conventionalists much better. With this particular quarrel I am not here concerned, but it is surprising that Agassi did not make more use of the works of Walter Paget, 1935-68, which would have supported some of his arguments strongly. On the whole, Agassi takes his own stand for autonomism, regarding Marxism as one of the failings of inductivists, and believing that contention between different schools was the main factor in the development of science. As his monograph comes from the University of Hong Kong, it seems that he encysted himself with extraordinary success from all contact with Chinese culture. End of note. However, the study of other civilizations places traditional historical thought in serious intellectual difficulty. For the most obvious and necessary kind of explanation which it demands is one which would demonstrate the fundamental differences in social and economic structure and mutability between Europe on the one hand and the great Asian civilizations on the other, differences which would account not only for the development of modern science in Europe alone, but also of capitalism in Europe alone, together with its typical accompaniments of Protestantism, nationalism, etc., not paralleled in any other part of the globe. They must in no way neglect the importance of a multitude of factors in the realm of ideas, language and logic, religion and philosophy, theology, music, humanitarianism, attitudes to time and change, but they will be most deeply concerned with the analysis of the society in question, its patterns, its urges, its needs, its transformations. In the internalist or autonomist view, such explanations are unwelcome, and do little to encourage the study of the other great civilizations. But if you reject the validity or even the relevance of sociological accounts of the scientific revolution of the late Renaissance, which brought modern science into being, if you renounce them as too revolutionary for that revolution, and if at the same time you wish to explain why Europeans were able to do what Chinese and Indians were not, then you are driven back upon an inescapable dilemma. One of its horns is called pure chance. The other is racialism, however disguised. To attribute the origin of modern science entirely to chance is to declare the bankruptcy of history as a form of enlightenment of the human mind. To dwell upon geography and harp upon climate as chance factors will not save the situation, for it brings you straight into the question of city-states, maritime commerce, agriculture, and the like, concrete factors with which autonomism declines to have anything to do. The Greek miracle, like the scientific revolution itself, is then doomed to remain miraculous. But what is the alternative to chance? Only the doctrine that one particular group of peoples, in this case the European race, possessed some intrinsic superiority to all other groups of peoples. Against the scientific study of human races, physical anthropology, comparative hematology, and the like, there can of course be no objection, but the doctrine of European superiority is racialism in the political sense, and has nothing in common with science. For the European autonomist, I fear, we are the people, and wisdom was born with us. Note, Job, chapter 12, 2. He is talking to Zophar, the Naamathite. Another translation runs, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. End of note. However, since racialism, at least in its explicit forms, is neither intellectually respectable nor internationally acceptable, the autonomists are in a quandary which may be expected to become more obvious as time goes on. Note, DJ de S. Price, a valued collaborator of our own, knew much of the Asian contribution, but in his Science Since Babylon 1961 follows a hunch of Einstein's and favours chance combination of circumstances as the evocators of Greek and Renaissance science. A.R. Hall, in Merton Revisited 1963, attacks anew what he calls the externalist historiography of science, but significantly keeps silence about the problem posed by the Asian contributions. If he had taken a broader comparative point of view, his arguments about the European situation might have carried more conviction. A.C. Crombie, alone of the three, shows a real consciousness of the slow social changes which permitted the intellectual movements of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance to bring modern science into being in the European culture area, but even he pays less attention to their economic concomitants. End of note. I confidently anticipate, therefore, a great revival of interest in the relations of science and society during crucial European centuries, as well as a study ever more intense of the social structures of all the civilizations, and the delineation of how they differed in glory one from another. In sum, I believe that the analyzable differences in social and economic pattern between China and Western Europe will in the end illuminate, as far as anything can ever throw light on it, both the earlier predominance of Chinese science and technology and also the later rise of modern science in Europe alone.